If you're anything like me, you probably get frustrated when you see how much dysfunction and contempt plague our political culture in this country, because it seems impossible to get anything done at the national level sometimes. But what if we already have the answer to these challenges if we're just willing to embrace it?
The problem is not the system, the problem is our adherence to it.
On this episode, we sit down with AEI scholar Yuval Levin, author of the new book American Covenant, who argues that the Constitution is actually built exactly for the era we find ourselves in today. And we discuss how you can actually get things done in our constitutional republic. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're talking about the Constitution, but in the context of how to apply it to many of the debates and disputes we see happening today in our political and public policy world. And to have this conversation, we're very excited to welcome a national expert, one of the best thought leaders on this issue that you'll find anywhere in the country. His name is Yuval Levin. He's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he also serves as the director of social, cultural, and constitutional studies. And of course, he's the author of American Covenant, a new book, How the Constitution Unified Our Nation and Could Again. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Yuval, welcome to Defending Ideas.
Thanks very much for having me.
We're grateful for your time and your work writing the book. It seems like we need this now as a country, which we'll get into in more detail. But first, for our listeners who may not be familiar, what would you say is what's just the elevator pitch? What's the short version of, here's what I argue in my book that folks really ought to know as we dive into this conversation?
Yeah, thank you. The book is a kind of reintroduction to the American Constitution from the vantage point of our need for national unity. And it makes the argument that the Constitution was intended to help our divided and diverse society hold together and govern itself, and that it offers a lot of ways of thinking that are especially valuable for us now when we struggle with division and polarization.
So Yuval, your book does a lot, almost just to kind of teach the reader about the Constitution, what it is, what it does, why it's structured the way it is. Can you talk about that for a minute? Why was that an important approach to take? And maybe a different way to think about it is, what do Americans get wrong about the Constitution? What do we forget that this book helps to remind us?
I do think about it as a kind of reintroduction exactly because we feel like we know the Constitution well, or at least Americans who are very engaged with politics or who follow politics have a sense that we know what the Constitution is. And what we think it is essentially a legal framework that sets the institutions and the procedures through which the national government operates and relates to the rest of our society. And of course, that is what the Constitution is. That's one thing that it is. It is a legal framework. But it's very important to understand that the Constitution is more than that. That it isn't just a set of definitions of institutions. It isn't just a set of constraints on government power. The Constitution really establishes the structure of our political life as a nation. And so while we should see it as law, and it is law, it declares itself to be the supreme law of the land, we also have to understand that it's a framework for making policy, for allowing government to govern. In fact, that's why the Constitution was necessary, because the previous system was ineffective as a policy-making framework, above all. It's also a set of institutions which are distinct from one another and have to be understood in institutional terms. They serve different purposes. I think here of Congress and the presidency and the courts, but also federalism and the structure of our politics that's established by the Constitution. It's also ultimately a kind of framework for our political life. It creates certain norms and expectations and assumptions about how we resolve disputes and how we deal with one another that I think are essential for us to understand and have really shaped our history. And so, at the end of the day, I think that all enables us to see the Constitution also as a framework for national unity. The first thing it declares itself to be trying to do is to form a more perfect union. That's the first goal in the preamble. It's not the only thing it's trying to do, but it's an extremely important purpose. And to see why and how it approaches that challenge, I think it's important to see the Constitution in full. So in a sense, the fact that we know the Constitution in one of its aspects very well keeps us from knowing the rest of it and requires us to kind of reintroduce ourselves fresh to just what it actually is.
Is that way that we tend to know it well, mostly through the lens of rights? I mean, kind of as I'm hearing you articulate this, I think, well, when I just see these kinds of debates online and on social media, it seems that individual citizens, just regular voters, view the Constitution as this is kind of what tells me what I'm allowed to do. I have a right to do this because it's secured, outlined in the Constitution. And sometimes policymakers view it as what they can't do. Well, I'd like to do this thing governmentally, but the Constitution says I can't do it. That seems like a myopic understanding based on what you're describing.
Yeah, in a funny way, a lot of us begin to think about the Constitution from the Bill of Rights, which is a set of amendments to the Constitution. What are the amendments to? They're amendments to an institutional framework that establishes government. So our rights are fundamentally constraints on government. They're things government can't do. The First Amendment begins with the words, Congress shall make no law, and then it lists the things that Congress can't touch. But before we see that, we have to see that the Constitution created Congress and created the presidency and created the judiciary, created a complicated federalist framework, created a government that can allow us to govern ourselves as a free society. And then it establishes some constraints on that government to make sure that it remains a free society. So yeah, I think we tend to jump right to the Bill of Rights and the 14th Amendment and all the sorts of ways in which the Constitution can protect us as individuals. But I think we have to see first and foremost that it is a way to govern and to govern ourselves as a society of self-governing citizens.
So, Yuval, there's something you're talking about that seems to me to get at the heart of maybe a lot of the confusion or the debates that we have today. And there's kind of the instinct from a conservative standpoint, for sure, and other political ideologies as well throughout history, to sort of reach for the Constitution is not necessarily new, but I want to ask you, there is, of course, a growing, you would know whether it's growing or not, but there is a movement that seeks to kind of view the Constitution as just kind of this old, outdated thing, that it's not as relevant to the debates and challenges we have today. The sense of, well, like, we need to update it, we need to change it because it doesn't work for the time we're in now. How do you respond to that?
So this is really one of the oldest kinds of critiques of the Constitution. The funny thing, when you look at the history of American constitutionalism, is that almost from the very beginning, you see people making the argument that the constitutional framework was fine for its moment at the end of the 18th century, but it's not up to governing a modern society. And modern society might mean the beginnings of industrialization in the 19th century. It might mean the emergence of corporate capitalism at the end of the 19th century. It might mean the emergence of different kinds of technologies of communication in the 20th century. Maybe it means the internet and globalization in our own time. But everybody seems to think, well, the Constitution was fine for when it was created, but it surely can't govern us. And a lot of the criticism that we hear now about the nature of the Constitution begins from this premise that it's a relic, that it isn't aware of the kinds of challenges we face, and so we need something else. I think this is actually exactly wrong, and that, in fact, the American Constitution is exceptionally sensitive to exactly the kind of challenge that we confront now, which is fundamentally and above all the challenge of how a diverse society can govern itself despite and through its very diversity. That challenge is the challenge of modern republicanism, because fundamentally the challenge is, how do you balance majority rule and minority rights? The American Constitution is extraordinarily sensitive to that problem. It begins from the premise that only majority rule can legitimate public action, but it also begins from the premise, the countervailing premise, which you can't avoid if you look at American history or at the history of democracy for 5 minutes, the premise that majorities can be oppressive. Obviously, that's true. It's been true in our history. It's been true in the history of most democracies. And so how do you establish a system that's rooted in majority rule, but that also respects the rights of individuals and of minority groups in society? The American Constitution is an answer to that question, an extremely sophisticated answer, much more so, in my view, than the parliamentary systems that you find in most other democracies around the world, because it doesn't empower simple majorities to rule. It requires them to grow and expand and broaden before they can exercise real power. That's the genius of the American system. It's also what's most frustrating about it for us, because the way that it forces majorities to expand is fundamentally by frustrating narrow majorities, by saying 50% plus one is not enough, try harder. And a lot of times, you win an election, especially in times of very, very narrowly divided politics like the 21st century, and you think, well, okay, we barely won, but we won. Now we get to do what we want. And the Constitution says, no, you got to deal with those other people. And majorities, narrow majorities can't stand that and inevitably complain about the Constitution as being too constricting. What it's saying to them is grow, broaden out so that you are a more durable and a more broadly representative majority, and then you can act. I don't think that's a relic at all. I think that's an extremely well-honed system for addressing the kind of challenge that we now confront. And so I would say to some of the contemporary critics of the Constitution that our system is more sophisticated than they are about the most serious problem that confronts every modern democracy, and that to the extent that we're struggling to address that problem, it's because we're failing to uphold the logic of the Constitution. The problem is not the system. The problem is our adherence to it.
Everything you just said resonates with me very deeply, and obviously from our vantage point here at Sutherland Institute, we try to take a very constructive approach to policymaking. I think for folks who have worked in or around public policy in a way, in any context where they've been successful, recognize that you have to be deliberative and constructive if you want to actually get something done. And I actually had a colleague in a previous role, a former colleague of mine who happened to be on the other side of the aisle politically than I was at the time, said, when you're evaluating public officials or people who work in this space, ask this question: do they want to make a point or do they want to make a difference? Seems like what you're saying is the Constitution is built for people who want to make a difference if they embrace it correctly. The folks who just want to make a point will, of course, be frustrated by the constitutional structure because or I guess another way to put it, the folks who want to make a difference sort of without having to yield anything to grow their coalition. And I'd love to get your thoughts on, again, that broadening the coalition, more durable, lasting coalitions makes a lot of sense. It kind of seems like people just don't want that today. They want a narrow majority, and they want their guy to be in office and to be able to do whatever they want and say, well, elections have consequences. We won, regardless of how big the margin was. Do you see that? Do Americans at large just not want to do the hard work of coalition building anymore? And if so, how do we fix it? Or is there more cause for optimism there than we might think?
To me, the key point in that question is coalition building. The Constitution wants us to operate in our politics by building coalitions. And that does mean, as you say, operating by thinking about how to bring people together and enable them to act while they continue to disagree about some significant problems and questions. And the way to do that is through give and take, is through negotiation and accommodation. And the Constitution, by frustrating narrow majorities, requires them to engage in coalition building. I think coalition building, the knack for coalition building, is exactly what we have been losing in our 21st century politics. The sense that what politics is for the hard work of reaching arrangements and accommodations despite differences so that we can arrive at public actions, collective action that none of us perfectly love, but all of us are willing to accept. That's what it takes to peacefully make progress against our problems in a free society. And it's true, we've been losing our patience for that in 21st century America. I think there are a number of reasons for that. There has been a change in our political culture, a kind of fragmentation of the ways by which we communicate, of the media, of the political environment, in a way that a lot of people now are able, if they want, to spend all their time with people they agree with, agreeing, and talking about people they disagree with, rather than talking to them. That's become much easier to do in American political life, and we choose to do it. It's just more enjoyable to spend your day with people you agree with than dealing with people who stand in your way. And so our political culture has become a set of echo chambers in which people, if they want, can spend all their time persuading themselves that the other side would destroy the country if it could. At the same time, and relatedly, we've lived through a very long stretch now of 50-50 politics at the national level in the United States. This is quite unusual. What's strange about our moment is not polarization, right? Polarization means the two parties don't like each other. We have just two parties for the most part, so yeah, they're polarized against each other. That's not new. What's new is deadlock. It's 50-50 for a long stretch. At most points in American history, if you'd looked in on our politics, you would see a majority party that is struggling to hold together a very complicated coalition and a minority party that's trying to broaden its coalition and become the majority. Both those parties are engaged in coalition building. That's their work, and they know that their core purpose is to bring people into the tent who aren't in yet, and so to make themselves persuasive and appealing and inviting. For the last 25 years or so, we've had two minority parties at the same time in American political life. And a lot of what that has meant is that they each define themselves fundamentally against the other. Their core argument to the public is less, here's what we can offer the future, and more, if those other guys get elected, the sky will fall. It'll be the end of the world, the end of democracy, the end of the American system. And so the most important thing is for them not to win. And that is a message that activates your base of voters. It's not a very inviting message to people who aren't sure who they want to vote for. And as a result, this 50-50 period has extended. It's been quite durable. And we've gone through a whole generation now of elections where the control of Congress is up for grabs every time. Control of the presidency swings back and forth a whole lot. We've just had 3 presidential elections in a row where partisan control of the White House has switched. That's only happened one other time in American history at the end of the 19th century. We've also had a president lose an election, wait out a term, and come back, which also has only happened one other time in that same moment at the end of the 19th century, the one other 50-50 period in our history. And all of that has taken us out of the habit and the practice of coalition building. We're less used to the notion that the job of politicians is to build coalitions for the purpose of accommodations. We've become instead used to the notion that the job of politicians is to clarify and sharpen the differences between the parties, to speak for the most intensely active and engaged citizens, rather than to find ways to build bridges and reach accommodations. And as a result, our political culture now has become less well-suited to the way the Constitution is meant to work. And the question we face is, do we need to change the system so it's more like our practice, or do we need to change our practice so it's more like the system? I am very much in the second camp. I don't think we should deform the Constitution to accommodate our terrible political vices in the 21st century. I think we need to recover some political virtues, and that we can do that by learning from the Constitution.
Yuval, how do we get people to want to get off this trajectory that our country is on? As you've articulated, the thought that came to mind was a good example of this perhaps is, from my vantage point, it seems that presidential elections in years past, the way you won was to persuade enough moderates to vote for you. Now the way you win is to fire up your base. So maybe that's true of elections at the state and local level too. That kind of feeds into your point. But I guess the core question of do people want this or not? A pop culture analogy comes to mind. The movie The Hunt for Red October, great film that I grew up watching as a kid. And there's a scene where Jack Ryan, the main character, is sort of talking to himself, trying to figure out, well, how are they going to get these Russian submariners off of the submarine? They'd have to want to get off. And he has kind of this click moment.
Yeah, in the mirror while shaving on the aircraft carrier. Yeah, I'm of the same generation.
So we're having, how do they have to want to get off this trajectory we're on? How do we do that?
So I think the the point we've all been missing in this period is that in a circumstance with two minority parties, nobody's winning. It can feel like winning sometimes when you get that 50% plus one and it's your party and you tell yourself it's a transformative election and everything's changed forever and you won a huge mandate even though you got 49% of the vote. Both parties have been doing this for 25 years. But in fact, neither of them is getting much done in the way of what their priorities are. And the country is not addressing some really core problems that pretty much everybody by now acknowledges are serious problems. And whether you think the big problems are the deficit or immigration or the environment, we're not taking them on. And it's not going to be possible to take them on unless we build coalitions that can do it by give and take, by bargaining and accommodation through a big, ugly deal that's somehow going to make some progress against the problem. And as long as we don't see that, these problems are going to fester and grow and rob our future of some of its potential. And so, to my mind, first of all, the reason people might want to change our direction here is because what we're doing isn't working. It's hard to convey that, harder than you might imagine, because if your party won the last election, you kind of feel like maybe it is working. Maybe this time we are turning the corner. But, my party won the last election, but it won by 49 to 48. And I don't think we're turning the corner. So it does seem to me like one way to begin to do that is by helping people see that to address our problems, we have to find ways to build broader coalitions behind some solutions. But also, not many Americans are happy with the way things are going now in our national politics. If you ask people, is this going well? You'd get very few people saying, yes, let's keep doing exactly what we're doing. So if we agree that things are not going well, we have to think about what could change. And a fair amount of what could change, it seems to me, has to do with enabling these institutions to function. And that does require thinking institutionally, thinking about Congress as failing, about the administrative state, about the courts, about federalism, the specific problems we see. But in each of these cases, I think a solution would require us to look back to the Constitution and could help refocus us again on coalition building as a goal. Our country is divided. I don't think we're going to have an election anytime soon like 1984 where Ronald Reagan won 49 states in the Electoral College. That's not happening. But I do think that we can have an election where somebody wins 55% of the vote rather than 49%, and that really would be a dramatically different kind of election. I do think that we can have a politics in which you begin by asking, how many members of the other party could vote for this tax bill we're trying to move? Both parties have passed major legislation in the last two presidencies where they didn't even ask that question. They just assumed they had to do it on their own and ended up with narrowly tailored legislation that doesn't endure and that doesn't address our most serious problems.
Yuval, my favorite example of what you're describing is an area that I do additional focused work in for Sutherland Institute in welfare reform and safety nets and upward mobility. And the 1996 welfare reform legislation, I always point to, certainly in my lifetime, that seems like the best example of broad, durable coalitions that I would articulate as a big legislative success for the country because, number one, there's just ample evidence that it changed the trajectories of low-income families, largely single moms with kids, in a pro-work, pro-upward mobility way. It had positive impact on poverty rates. So that was a significant reform that happened in the 90s. It happened under divided government. You have President Bill Clinton in the White House, you have a Republican Congress, and it really was this kind of give-and-take coalition that got that through, and that has stood the test of time, and there's a lot of conversations now about how can we build on that. And so to me, it's like that's the thing we should be striving for. I want to elect people to go to Congress and say, that's the kind of thing that I want to accomplish while I'm there. And this idea of coalition building, to me, I think it seems to draw a very strong connection with the idea of unity, that you talk about at length, you write about it in your book. In fact, your last chapter is devoted to unity. And there's a quote that I want to read from your book on this idea of unity. And you say in the book, unity is less about thinking alike than about acting together. So I want to ask you what that means and put a little bit of a political context on it. When President Biden was inaugurated, during his inaugural speech, he said the word unity like 50 times. I don't know. He just over and over again was saying it's all about unity. The election's done. The American people need unity. I was skeptical because my assumption that I feel like was borne out through the course of his administration was that unity means agree with me and we can have unity. That's not really what it means, though, right?
Exactly. I think a lot of times when our politicians talk about unity, which they do a lot in this divided moment, as you say, what they mean is if people would just agree with me, then everything would be great. And, we all believe that at some level. I think if people just agreed with me, everything would be great. But I don't think it makes sense to expect that to actually happen. And we don't. It isn't going to happen. The Constitution does not expect that to happen. And the framers were very explicit about that expectation. James Madison says in Federalist 10, as long as the reason of man continues fallible and he's at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed, period. In other words, diversity of views is just a function of freedom. And I think anybody who's spent any time trying to get people together around a table knows that that is the case. Somebody's going to disagree. And that's a reality you have to start from. And the implicit understanding of unity in the Constitution is therefore not that unity will mean thinking alike and agreeing about everything, but that unity will mean acting together despite disagreement. Now, that does force us to ask, how? How are you supposed to act together when you don't think alike? And I would say, look at the institutions created by the Constitution. They are answers to that question. How do you act together when you don't think alike? One answer is federalism. There are different ways to resolve problems in different places, and those can happen at the same time, and we're still one country. The crucial answer, the central answer, is Congress, which is basically a venue for acting together when you don't think alike, for reaching agreements and accommodations and finding ways to work together. The presidency and the courts, in their own ways, also facilitate the environment that's necessary for that to be possible. And at the end of the day, the system is there to allow us to be a unified country, which doesn't mean unanimous, which doesn't mean our disagreements go away. A society where everybody agreed would not need politics. And there's never been such a society. Politics is there to resolve disagreements. But what that means is that it is possible to be unified even when we don't all have the same opinions, even about some pretty important questions. And so as long as we share a commitment to that structure, to the Constitution and the very general principles that underlie it, a commitment to human equality and to the ideals of a Republican society, then I do think we can address problems and reach genuine national unity and cohesion, even while we certainly do continue to disagree.
It seems that in many of our political and policy fights today, the respective sides, and I think this is certainly true of both of the major sides in our political divisions, kind of rush to their preferred solution or outcome immediately, and sometimes kind of view the Constitution as an afterthought of, well, this is what we want to do. We'll figure out later if that's constitutionally appropriate. Or sometimes even view it as a roadblock to say that, well, this is sort of a barrier we need to circumvent somehow. One, I want to ask you if you think that's true, if that's a fair characterization of what's happening. And two, ask you about the cause of that, meaning when people ignore, circumvent the Constitution, whatever term we want to apply, when they do that, is it driven by just a lack of understanding of what the true constitutional structure is in terms of guiding them? Or is it they understand it, they just kind of don't care, and they want to get away with whatever they can get away with?
Well, I think there is some mix of both. There's a natural desire when you're trying to advance change in law or policy to just want to do it. I know what I want, and I just want to get it done. And when something stands in your way, and the system somehow says, well, you can't do it this way, you got to do it that way, and that way is slower and requires more people to agree, the frustration is natural. Some of it is a function of just not knowing that this is how things have to work, but some of it is a function of just not wanting to care. We want to move faster. And I think the Constitution is built on an understanding that that would be the attitude some of the time. That's why there is a judiciary, to force the other branches to keep to their place and to restrain majorities now and then, too. It's why we have a system of laws, and ultimately the rule of law means that it is the law that has the authority in our system, not the elected officials, not the Democratic majority of the moment, but the system itself as a whole. A lot of what the system does is restrain majorities. In fact, when we talk about rights and we say rights constrain the government, well, what that really means is that even if a majority of voters wants to deny someone's religious freedom, they can't do it. And they can't do it because our Constitution sets up certain boundaries around what we can do, even when a lot of us want to do it. Part of what that means is that knowing the Constitution means knowing that there are constraints on your own will. That's hard in a democracy. But recognizing that means taking your fellow citizens seriously, treating them as people to work with, to deal with, sometimes literally to make deals with. And that's what the Constitution intends us to do. So I do think there's some constitutional ignorance, naturally, but there's also a kind of willfulness that's natural to democracy that the Constitution actually wants to combat some and to constrain.
How, to put it in a maybe simple kind of crude way, how do we make the Constitution sexy again? How do we make it that whether you want to be the best Republican or the best Democrat or the best whatever, if you're a candidate for office, how do we instill in voters that, hey, the best metric by which you should measure this person, first and foremost, is how well do they understand the Constitution and want to articulate a sound defense of it, where they would say, look, there's a lot of stuff I'd love to do, but I am bound by the Constitution. And all of our elected officials take oaths to that effect. But I guess how do we, enforce it, make it more likely that voters will expect that and voters will hold elected officials accountable based on how well they actually do demonstrate fidelity to the Constitution?
I really wish I had a great answer to that question. I think part of it is a matter of civic education, of helping ourselves know the system better than we tend to. And some of it is also a matter of seeing that it's only by working through this process that we can actually make durable change in our system. So that when a president promises you, on day one, I'm going to sign a paper that turns this issue you care about all the way around, you should think, well, okay, but then the next president from the other party is going to sign a paper doing the opposite. How do we actually resolve this? And the answer is work through the processes established in the system, and especially in a way that puts Congress front and center. Do this legislatively, which means do it by reaching accommodations. I think seeing that, it's actually the case that the people who are most frustrated with the Constitution, the activists who want to achieve, who know exactly what they want, those are the people who should most value the Constitution, because to get what they want and keep it, they have to work through that system. Otherwise, they end up doing things that don't endure and that don't really make the kind of change they want. And so I think recognizing the value of the system in that way is one means for helping us apply it as a test for politicians. But a lot also depends just on simple education. Americans need to know the system, to know why it's there, what it's meant to do, what questions it's an answer to. I think we've got a lot of work to do on that front.
Yeah, in your book, you talk about kind of each of the constitutional institutions, for lack of a better way to describe it, in depth. And again, I obviously encourage folks to go out and buy and read the book. But there's two that I want to focus on, Congress and the presidency. And you've articulated, and it's a common kind of trope by now, that, well, Congress is broken for various reasons. So I want to ask you, is Congress broken? If so, in what way, and how do we fix it? And then also, do you feel similarly about the presidency? Is the presidency in some ways broken? And if so, how would we fix it?
Well, I think there is very broad agreement now that Congress is somewhat dysfunctional. And in a way, that agreement actually masks an important underlying disagreement. When you hear somebody say Congress is dysfunctional, you should ask them, what function is it not performing? The natural answer, the intuitive answer to that question is Congress is not passing big legislation, again, to address the fiscal problems or immigration or the environment or whatever you think is the big problem. That's true. But I would argue that what the function Congress is failing to perform is the core function assigned to it in the Constitution, which is to facilitate cross-partisan bargaining and accommodation. Now, that's also why it's not passing big legislation. But to see the underlying problem makes a big difference, because if you think the problem is Congress is just not passing big bills, then you want Congress to be more efficient. And so you might want to centralize power and leadership. You might want to get rid of the filibuster. You might want to just allow things to move faster. But if the problem is that Congress is not facilitating bargaining and accommodation, you actually want Congress to be less efficient. You want to decentralize power so that there's a reason for members to deal with each other rather than just whoever has the tiny majority gets to do everything. You love the filibuster, as I do, because it's the only reason we've had any bipartisan legislation in the last 25 years. And by the way, it's also prevented a lot of very terrible ideas. And so if you think that what's necessary is a Congress with bargaining and deal-making at its center, you want a Congress that is focused on its legislative work, where the power flows through the committee system and where members deal with each other, where they actually confront one another across lines of difference and have to make arrangements. Those are the kinds of reforms that I suggest in the book. They're ideas that are very much in the minority among the little world of congressional reformers. Most of the people in that world would like to have a more efficient Congress, a little bit more of a parliamentary system, where if you won the majority, you get to do whatever you want until you lose the majority. I don't think the American system would be well served by that kind of change. So I do think Congress is dysfunctional now, but I think it's important to see that what it's failing to do is allow for coalitions to form, including some peculiar, strange bedfellow kinds of coalitions that could allow for legislation that isn't what either party's leadership wants, but that is what a meaningful majority of members would want. The executive, I would argue that the executive is broken in large part because Congress is broken. And really, I think the weakness of Congress, the intentional weakness of Congress, the way in which its partisanship means that it doesn't legislate, has created a vacuum at the core of the American system, and that presidents and courts now rush to fill that vacuum. We're going to talk a lot in the next few years about executive power. We're going to talk some about judicial power, too, because there are going to be a lot of clashes between the president and the courts. I think it's important to remember that the reason those are happening is that Congress is not doing its job. It's what's missing that we should see, not what we have too much of, but what we have too little of. And if Congress were doing its job, were legislating in specific, concrete ways, the president would have a lot less leeway to take control of the policy process in the way that presidents do now, and the courts would have a lot less room to push and pull, as the courts inevitably do when all kinds of big questions are created as a result of excessive executive power. And so I certainly think there are things to fix in the executive branch, but Congress is foremost, and its problems are the biggest problems for the system in this moment.
Do you think that's one of the reasons why there, at least from my perspective, in my view, there seems to be more and more of a push among voters of, I mean, to put it in a kind of blunt way, embracing authoritarianism, meaning I just want my president to be elected and I want him to do whatever he needs to do to effectuate the policy priorities I like. Everything else, I don't care. It seems like that's more and more present in our politics today. And in fact, at a recent Sutherland Institute event, you were here in Utah and spoke along with Governor Spencer Cox and Judge Thomas Griffith. Great event. We have the full video up on YouTube as well for our audience to go catch up on. But this point kind of came up. I think it was Judge Griffith who made it. Does it seem like people kind of want a king? And is that true? And maybe it is just kind of motivated, as you're saying, by sort of the gap that's being left by Congress. Is that the right way to think about it?
I think so. I think people want the problems they confront to be solved, the problems that are political in nature, that government could do something about. People feel like those problems just lay there and we don't do anything about them, and that's true. And the only agent in our politics who seems capable of assertive action in this moment is the president. And so we look to presidents to do all kinds of things that properly understood are really congressional functions. And presidents encourage this. A president will say, Congress won't act, so I will. Whether, again, that's on immigration or building a wall or forgiving student loans, all kinds of things that really only Congress could do. When Congress doesn't, presidents respond to public pressure by saying they can do it on their own. And that creates a kind of opening for, if not authoritarianism, at least vastly excessive executive power in our system. And the expectation of that kind of power. Part of the problem that creates is that it raises the stakes of presidential elections way higher than they ought to be and gives people the impression that everything depends on who the president is at any given time. And that puts a weight and a pressure on presidential elections that they can't really bear and shouldn't, because ultimately a president can't make durable change without Congress. And so we have to see that if all we're asking for is just the executive to do what we want, then we're creating an opening for the other party to do the same when they win, which they probably win pretty soon. I mean, if we look at our recent history, it's a lot of back and forth. Presidents spend half their time undoing what their predecessor did, and then the other half doing things their successor will undo. And that is not a constructive way for our politics to work. So I think even in our expectations, we have to recover a sense of the centrality of Congress.
Yuval, we just have just a few minutes left. My last question for you, as I sit and hear this and have this conversation with you, everything I'm like, yes, I'm on board. Let's do it. Let's go. How do we actually do this? And I imagine some of our listeners and viewers out there are feeling similarly. So if there's a national initiative to go and effectuate these things, sign me up. For folks who might feel that way, say that this is all great. How do we actually do it? How do we change things? Can you leave our audience with any kind of guidance or talking points that they can use, or what's the one big thing we need to focus on? Just view it as almost like all the folks listening out there they're soldiers ready to enlist in the fight of restoring the Constitution to the center of our civic and political culture. Help us understand how to do it moving forward.
Well, I think there are some ideas that we have to socialize better in American political culture. And in some ways, above all, the basic idea that the purpose of our politics is coalition building has been lost to us. And we've got to recover it even as voters. We should look for politicians who promise to build broad coalitions to solve problems, because those are the people who really know how to solve problems. And oftentimes now our politics is dominated by the people who least want to build coalitions, who want the narrowest achievable majority so that they have to make the fewest possible concessions. And that's not a way to advance durable change in our system. I also think we have to stress the importance of Congress when we think about politics. Ask ourselves, what's Congress doing? What's the state legislature doing? Rather than only what the executives in government are doing. And, ultimately, change in our country can be bottom-up. The American system is beautifully decentralized. We should never forget that most governing happens at the state and local level, and it's not a waste of your energy to be involved in local politics and certainly in state politics, where political culture ultimately bubbles up from. A lot of political leadership begins at the state and local level. And so to improve the political culture in those places is a way to start to change the political culture in our national politics too. And, it's not all about being glued to a screen and watching what the president is doing. Ultimately, the most important office in a republic is not the president, it's the citizen. And each of us holds that office, and we have to take it seriously.
That is an excellent place to end. The book is American Covenant. The author is Yuval Levin from the American Enterprise Institute. Yuval, thank you so much for being with us on Defending Ideas.
Thanks very much for having me.
We're going to take one quick break before we leave you all with some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back. I'm sure you're asking yourself what you're supposed to do with everything that Yuval just articulated about the Constitution. Here's a good place to start. Every time you or I evaluate a candidate for office or a current elected official, no matter their party, ask yourself this question. Do they truly understand the constraints and structure that the Constitution provides for their office? And are they willing to operate within that structure? Reach for this principle first, before reaching for partisan talking points. Now, I know that's much easier said than done, especially in our highly charged political environment. But I really believe that the only way forward as a country is if we make true fidelity to the Constitution the first and most important measure by which we decide whether to support or vote for a candidate for office. Too often, our elected officials, and even we as voters, think of the Constitution simply as an afterthought that has some annoying constraints on what we would hope to see accomplished at the national level. This is the wrong way to view it. We'll get more big policy wins, actually, by embracing the true purpose and structure of the Constitution and by broadening our coalitions accordingly to solve some of our nation's biggest challenges. Make this principle non-negotiable when you decide who to vote for and who to support. And I promise you, it'll make a difference for our nation. That is it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed this discussion, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. Don't forget to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you like to get your shows. And please share this episode on your own social media profiles or with a friend, family member, or coworker who you think might find it interesting. And lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this, please make a contribution at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks again for joining us on Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.